At 74, Sondra Locke finally broke her silence. The room was quiet, too quiet. A single lamp flickered against the dust that floated like old film grain in the air. Her voice, when it came, was soft, tired, yet strangely steady. "He tried to erase me," she said, "not just from his life, but from Hollywood itself. For a long time, no one knew what she meant. How could anyone erase a woman who had once stood beside Clint Eastwood, the man the world saw as the ultimate symbol of American masculinity? The rugged face, the half-smile, the myth. Together they had been photographed, celebrated, mythologized. To the public, they were power and passion fused into one perfect image. But that image, she now confessed, had been built on fear. Behind the closed doors of their shared homes in Carmel and Los Angeles, the story was different. Scripts disappeared. Calls were redirected. Directors who once wanted to work with her suddenly stopped calling. "It wasn't a breakup," she whispered. "It was a slow erasure." The years blurred into silence. She stopped working, stopped speaking. She existed, but only as an echo of his fame. "He could build entire worlds on screen," she said, "and he built one for me, a cage made of love." Outside, the rain fell softly on the Pacific. Somewhere, far away, Clint Eastwood was still making films, still winning awards, still being adored. But here, in this small, quiet room, Sondra Locke was telling a story that could shatter the legend of Hollywood's lone hero. Because what she revealed was not about revenge. It was about survival, the price of being loved by a man whose power came from control. She paused, her eyes fixed on the recorder. "I used to think silence was safety," she murmured. "Now I know it was the most dangerous thing of all." The tape clicked off. The room fell into stillness again. And for the first time in decades, Sondra Locke's voice no longer belonged to him. It belonged to history. How do you erase a woman without ever touching her? And what happens when the ghost decides to speak? Before she became the woman Clint Eastwood tried to erase, Sondra Locke had been the kind of actress Hollywood once adored, delicate, intelligent, and quietly defiant. Born in Tennessee in 1944, she arrived in Los Angeles with the wide-eyed belief that talent could still change destiny. She was small, fragile even, but her gaze carried something fierce, a refusal to be ordinary. Her first major role in The Heart is A Lonely Hunter, 1968, earned her an Oscar nomination. Critics called her the next great American actress, and directors saw in her a rare balance between vulnerability and strength. She wasn't made for glamour, she was made for truth. That, perhaps, was her first mistake in a city built on illusions. When she met Clint Eastwood on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1975, their chemistry was instant and combustible. He was already a star, the face of rugged independence, the cowboy who never needed anyone. She, on the other hand, was drawn to complexity, to the humanity behind masks. On screen, they look like opposites destined to collide. Off screen, that collision became a storm. In public, they were inseparable. Photographers caught them laughing on red carpets, driving through Carmel in his pickup, standing together at film premieres as if they shared an unbreakable secret. The tabloids called her Mrs. Eastwood, though they never married. Friends described her as his muse, his anchor, the one who softened him. For more than a decade, she was by his side through award seasons, directorial triumphs, and political campaigns. But even then, the cracks were visible to those who looked closely. Clint was charming in public, but controlling in private. He decided where they lived, who she saw, and which roles she could accept. He was the sun, she would later write, and I lived in his orbit. At first, she believed it was love, the possessive, consuming kind that feels like protection. When he produced Bronco, Billy, and Sudden Impact, both featuring her, she thought they were partners in art and life. Yet the more she worked with him, the smaller she became in the world beyond him. Offers vanished. Directors stopped calling. Even her friends began to drift away. It was as if Clint's shadow followed her everywhere, a silent reminder of who really held the power. Inside their home, the imbalance deepened. Clint rarely spoke of emotions. He preferred control to connection. When he smiled, it was often at his reflection in her admiration. She became the audience to his myth. The illusion, however, was perfect to everyone else. Hollywood adored them as a power couple, a beautiful contradiction, the stoic legend and the fragile artist. They attended events together, smiled for cameras, and played their parts. To outsiders, it looked like a fairy tale. But inside that golden frame, Sondra felt herself fading. The irony was cruel. She lived with one of the most powerful directors in the world. Yet she was losing her own voice as an actress. As a woman, each decision he made for her came disguised as care. Each limitation sounded like love. You don't need that project. Heads say, it's beneath you. Or, you're too good for that director. In time, she stopped arguing. What she didn't know was that Clint had a pattern, a need to control not just women, but the narrative around him. His image as the lone, stoic man depended on silence. Emotion was weakness, dependence, humiliation. Every woman who loved him risked becoming invisible the moment she no longer served the myth. By the late 1980 seconds, their relationship had become a ritual of control disguised as romance. Sondra tried to direct her own film, Rat Boy 1986, hoping to step outside his shadow. The industry mocked her, and when the film failed, Clint withdrew his support entirely. The project that was meant to free her became another reason for him to dominate her career. Still, she stayed. Out of fear, loyalty, perhaps hope. In interviews, she spoke kindly of him, calling him a brilliant man, complex, misunderstood. She smiled, even when that smile cost her something. Then, one night, it ended not with a fight, but with a lock. Literally. She returned home to find the locks changed. Clint had moved her belongings to a storage facility and cut off all contact. The man who had built his legend on stoic independence now erased the woman who had shared his life. To the public, it was just another Hollywood breakup. But for Sondra Locke, it was an existential collapse. Her identity, her home, her career, everything was tied to a man who now pretended she had never existed. The illusion shattered slowly, like glass in water. The power couple was gone. The cameras turned away. And for the first time, she saw herself not as his partner, but as his ghost. People think I was lucky to be loved by Clint Eastwood, she said years later. But luck has a cruel sense of humor in Hollywood. She had once believed she was part of his legend. Now, she realized she had been written out of it. After the locks changed and her name vanished from his address book, Sondra Locke disappeared. To the public, It seemed voluntary, another actress retreating from the limelight. But to those who knew her, it was something closer to exile. She had been silenced not by scandal, but by erasure. And in Hollywood, silence is the cleanest weapon. For months, she drifted through small apartments and borrowed spaces, surviving on savings that dwindled too fast. The industry that once admired her now treated her as radioactive. Clint Eastwood's quiet influence was everywhere, an unspoken warning in meetings. A polite smile from studio heads that said, "We'd rather not get involved." She later described those years as a slow death. Each phone that didn't ring, each letter unanswered, felt like another nail sealing her out of the life she had built. And yet, beneath the despair, something stubborn flickered, an instinct not to vanish. In 1990, she began writing. Not scripts, not roles, but memories, pages filled with pain and disbelief. "I was trying to understand," she said, "how love could turn into punishment." The words became her lifeline. They were messy, angry, raw, but they were hers. Behind every memory, a question pulsed: when did love become control? When did devotion turn into captivity? She remembered the first time Clint called her mine. It had sounded romantic then, a promise wrapped in power. But love that defines you can also confine you. Slowly, she realized she had been cast in a role she never auditioned for, the silent woman behind the great man. The most painful truth wasn't what he did, but what she allowed. "I mistook control for care," she confessed. "I thought his dominance meant I mattered." It was a revelation that cracked open her sense of self. Love, she saw now, had been the most elegant disguise for fear. Those who visited her during that time described a woman both fragile and fierce. She spoke softly, but with growing conviction. There was bitterness. Yes, but also a strange peace, a recognition that she could no longer wait for justice from a man who saw her as collateral damage. It was then that the truth began to unfold piece by piece. Clint had not only locked her out of their home, but had quietly manipulated her professional life. He financed a production deal for her at Warner Bros., a gesture that seemed generous. Yet the deal was an illusion. She later learned it existed only to keep her occupied and silent. None of her projects were ever approved, none funded beyond paperwork. It was a phantom contract, a leash disguised as opportunity. When she discovered the deception, she described the feeling as a second betrayal, colder than the first. It was no longer about heartbreak. It was about dignity. In the years that followed, she lived quietly, almost invisibly. Friends say she spent hours walking by the ocean, her face hidden behind sunglasses, listening to the waves as if they could wash the years away. The world had forgotten her, but she was learning something that fame never teaches: the beauty of existing without being seen. Her memoir, The Good, the Bad, and the very ugly 1997, became her act of defiance. It was not revenge, it was resurrection. Each chapter stripped away another layer of illusion. She wrote not as a victim, but as a witness to herself, to power, to the machinery of silence. In one passage, she wrote, "He didn't just want to win. He wanted to define me, then destroy the definition." The book shocked Hollywood. Many refused to believe her. Others whispered in private that they understood too well. Every woman who had ever loved a powerful man read it like a confession they'd never dared to make. Still, the truth came at a cost. No new roles followed. No directors called. But for the first time, that didn't matter. Sondra Locke had reclaimed the one thing Clint Eastwood could never control: her voice. Behind that voice, however, lived years of emotional debris. She spoke of nightmares where she wandered through empty sets, her lines erased, her name fading from the credits. She spoke of waking up in the night, half expecting to hear his boots on the floorboards, the sound of control returning. Yet over time, those dreams softened. The more she wrote, the more she spoke, the less he haunted her. "It's strange," she told a friend. "The man I feared most has become smaller in my memory. I think forgiveness isn't about kindness. It's about taking back the space they once occupied." By the late 1990 seconds, she had transformed her pain into something else, a quiet clarity. She began painting again, visiting small art galleries, surrounding herself with people who saw her not as a relic of Clint Eastwood's past, but as a survivor of her own story. And yet, she never pretended healing was simple. "People like to believe pain makes you wise," she once said. "But sometimes, it just makes you tired." When asked why she stayed silent for so long, she smiled sadly, "Because silence was what he taught me best." Then she paused, looking off camera. "But I am not his student anymore." That moment, soft, trembling, unguarded, wasn't cinematic. It was human. The kind of truth that doesn't fit neatly into headlines or documentaries. Her story, in the end, wasn't just about Clint Eastwood or Hollywood or fame. It was about the invisible wounds that come from being loved by someone who mistakes control for care, power for protection, silence for peace. For Sondra Locke, speaking out wasn't revenge, it was release. She had spent years living as a reflection in someone else's mirror. Now, finally, she saw herself whole. Love had imprisoned her, but truth, slow, quiet, relentless, set her free. The real breaking point didn't come from heartbreak, it came from a file folder. In 1994, after years of silence, Sondra Locke sued Clint Eastwood for fraud and emotional distress. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wanted the truth on record. What emerged in court stunned even those who thought they already knew how dark Hollywood power could be. Inside that folder were documents showing that the development deal Clint had arranged for her at Warner Bros., worth millions on paper, had been a fabrication. The studio had no intention of producing her projects. The money had come directly from Eastwood's own accounts, routed through the studio as part of a private settlement to keep her occupied. It wasn't generosity. It was containment. In one deposition, an executive admitted, "We were told to say yes to her ideas, then quietly kill them later." For Sondra, the revelation landed like a physical blow. Every script Shed poured herself into, every meeting Shed thought was progress, had been part of an elaborate illusion designed to neutralize her. "He didn't just want me gone," she said later. "He wanted me forgotten." The courtroom became a stage where two ghosts of their former selves faced off. Clint sat expressionless, calm, his hands folded. Sondra, thinner now, her voice trembling but unbroken, told the story of a decade-long erasure. The headlines were brutal. Eastwood's ex strikes back. The woman who sued Dirty Harry. The tabloids painted her as bitter, delusional, unstable. The same narrative that had once romanticized her fragility now used it against her. But beneath the noise, something powerful shifted. The mask cracked, not hers, but his. Hollywood's stoic cowboy, the man of silent integrity, had engineered a deception so cold it stunned even his admirers. The myth of the lone hero who never lied was suddenly human, painfully human. For Sondra, the lawsuit wasn't about winning money, it was about reclaiming narrative. She settled the case quietly in 1996. The terms undisclosed. But her silence after that was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of closure. You can't erase someone who remembers herself, she said to a journalist after the settlement. The irony was cinematic. Clint Eastwood went on to direct Mystic River, Million Dollar Baby, Gran Torino films about guilt, redemption, and moral reckoning. Audiences called them profound. Critics praised his sensitivity toward broken souls. But to those who knew Sondra's story, the themes felt hauntingly familiar. He had built his artistic redemption on the ruins of her real one. When asked years later whether she'd forgiven him, Sondra hesitated. "Forgiveness isn't a word I use easily," she said. "But I've stopped needing him to understand." That was the truest form of liberation, indifference. The biggest shock wasn't the fraud, the lawsuit, or the betrayal. It was the realization that love, when mixed with power, can rewrite reality itself. Clint Eastwood didn't destroy Sondra Locke's life in one act. He did it through the slow, methodical rewriting of her existence. Yet in doing so, he revealed the very weakness he tried to hide, his fear of being seen for who he truly was, a man terrified of losing control. In 2018, when Sondra Locke passed away from cancer, the news barely made headlines. The obituaries mentioned her films, her Oscar nomination, and her long relationship with Eastwood. But they omitted the war she had fought to reclaim her name. Clint Eastwood, as usual, said nothing. But silence can no longer rewrite truth. In the end, the man who built his legend on words unspoken was undone by a woman who finally spoke. Her voice, recorded years earlier, echoed like a verdict. "He tried to erase me." But to erase someone, you have to stop them from feeling, and he never could. In the stillness that followed, the myth of power stood exposed not as strength, but as fear wearing a man's face. And perhaps that was her final victory, not revenge, not recognition, but the knowledge that the one who tried to silence her would spend eternity haunted by the sound of her voice. In the end, there were no heroes, no villains, only two people trapped in the illusion of power. Clint Eastwood built his empire on control, and Sondra Locke paid for it with silence. But what neither of them could control was time. Because time, unlike Hollywood, never lies. Years after the headlines faded, Sondra's story began to reappear, not in courtrooms or gossip columns, but in quiet essays, podcasts, and late-night discussions among women who recognized themselves in her struggle. To them, she wasn't just Clint Eastwood's forgotten lover. She was a symbol of something larger, the invisible cost of loving a powerful man. Her pain became a kind of testimony, not the kind carved into monuments, but whispered between generations. Don't let anyone write your story for you. Hollywood moved on, as it always does, chasing younger faces and newer myths. Clint Eastwood kept making films about men who seek forgiveness but never find it. Perhaps that was his own confession, disguised as art. Perhaps every frame was an apology he could never say aloud. But Sondra didn't need his apology. Her life, though quiet, ended in peace. In her final interviews, she spoke not of revenge, but of understanding. "I used to think he took everything from me," she said softly. "But the truth is, he taught me what freedom costs." Freedom, she realized, wasn't about walking away from someone. It was about walking back into yourself. The tragedy of their story is not that love failed, but that it became a weapon neither knew how to put down. He built walls to feel safe. She broke them to feel alive. In the end, both were left with emptiness, but only one turned that emptiness into light. Sondra Locke will never have the legacy Clint Eastwood enjoys. Her name will not echo in Oscars or retrospectives. But her voice, fragile and unwavering, carries something rarer than fame, truth. Because in a world obsessed with power, her story reminds us that survival itself can be a masterpiece. And maybe that is the final irony, that the woman he tried to erase became the only one who could tell the truth about him.